What is then this dad exaggeration effect that we started discussing at the end of the previous lecture? I've tried to suggest that it's a really crucial element in how we would consider going about a Lacanian revisiting of the Oedipus complex. Let's then respond to one question which immediately comes to mind. What, though, are we to do in situations when there is no dad? Or when the dad seems to be a kind of pathetic figure? How can you have a dad exaggeration effect? Well, when we discuss the name of the father, we try to give a whole series of examples from E.T. to Mary Poppins, where dad was either not particularly operating very well, or in fact was a completely hopeless figure, as in the Mary Poppins Returns film. So with that in mind, we can bear in mind that the dad exaggeration effect is something which involves taking a symbolic element, maybe it's Mary Poppins, something outside of the ordinary domain of everyday experiences, and elevating it. That's why over here I've spoken about an appeal to a meta element or a disproportionate signifier. Without going into too much of a detour, Lacan is aware of this and in fact makes this theorization precisely in Freud's Little Hans case. Little Hans has a dad who makes every effort not to be the castrating bad father or formidable law-imposing father. And in fact, poor little Hans, in a way, is not able to have an Oedipus complex until he finds some element, something outside the domain of everyday roles to invest in, to do a kind of hyper-investment in. And of course, it's the phobic element of a horse. That's another lecture altogether, but the point here is the exaggeration, the dad exaggeration effect doesn't necessarily have to be with dad. Presumably, in many instances, it would be with the figure of the father, precisely because, as I've tried to say before, the role of this dad exaggeration effect is to try and find some symbolic coordinate, some importance, some law, something outside the domain of mom. And presumably, it would then be something associated with mom, but also something that signifies mom's lack or mom's desire. But we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. We want to do this move from dyad to triangulation. And here comes the embarrassing self-revelation moments. I was in analysis for 7 years, a long time. And one of the things that really surprised me was how much of that time I ended up speaking about dad stuff. It was like, you know, I got 2 parents, I think I've got kind of a relationship. In fact, if anything, I feel more of a kind of emotional whatever connection or something in terms of mom. Where did all the dad stuff come from? Now, presumably, this is, again, an instance where I'm just anecdotalizing. So, you know, you could take it with a pinch of salt. But it's interesting, isn't it? You could say that for maybe obsessional men, the question of the dad somehow becomes an important one. And here's the point that I'm trying to build to. And again, it's kind of anecdotal thing. It's not necessarily just about the figure of the actual father, but about the symbolic space, or indeed the unconscious ruminations about something about paternity, or that space outside that pulls me outside of a maternal relationship. And here's the kind of embarrassing revelation. I think for a great many men of my generation, I was brought up in South Africa, so maybe I need to locate it there as well. In this kind of patriarchal, more old school situation, I think for a great number of, let's say, heterosexual men, trying to be a little bit more specific, okay, I'm talking about my friends basically, but whatever, for them, and I think it's indicative of masculinity and heterosexual masculinity more generally, but you may correct me, that at some point in our lives, it becomes less than possible. There's a barrier of sorts that emerges between me and my mom. A barrier of sorts which in many psychoanalytic texts people would say, this is the prohibition of incest or whatever. We could give it different names. We don't have to necessarily be so dramatic. But here's the point. My suggestion is, particularly, you know, for me or again, men of my generation, that this kind of barrier, this kind of separation, this kind of virtuality sets in, maybe it's a hallmark, it is, for Lacan, a hallmark of neurosis, in a way that I can never in any direct way reconnect to that ocean of love that would have characterized, that ocean of love, of nurturance, and this is psychoanalysis after all, desire, wishfulness, care, that characterized my maternal love, or my love for my mom. that is no longer something I can access directly. Why would we say that is? Something seems to have mediated it, moderated it, lessened it, maybe repressed it. We can use a whole series of different words for that. We could also say, I mean, it sounds sad, but you could also say, thank goodness. If I was still being characterized by the intensity of that early, affective, in some ways defining, and I use the word ocean of love because it was huge, life would be a bit weird, right? I wouldn't be easily separable from my mom. I would be presumably inside some kind of more incestuous relationship, and I don't mean that in the most literal senses, but presumably that's not really socially viable. So in many ways, the Oedipus Complex and this Lacanian revisitation of the Oedipus Complex is trying to formulate why that barrier has come to play its part. Now I wanted to make just one further comment there. You could say that it has never fully gone away. But you could also say that many, whatever, neurotic heterosexual men, in their relationships to their moms, it's somehow a little stilted, it's somehow a little virtual, it's somehow kind of respectful, yes, but it's not the lived intensity of again, oceanic kind of love. But then let's just make one quick qualification. I remember reading Sebastian Faulks's novel Birdsong, which is about the First World War. And there was a line in it about a soldier, I believe, who's witnessing many men die. And he says, in the last moments of a man's life, they will often say something like, Mom. And I remember reading it and I thought, I don't know, man, I don't think I'm going to do that. And then subsequently, I had a couple of experiences where I realized there is more than a little bit of truth in that. So let's just then say that there is this relationship, this intense, and let's also remember that for a significant portion of all of our lives, if we have been nurtured, if we have made it this far, if we are alive, if we have a kind of nurtured, loving relationship from someone, presumably our mothers, that we at one stage even shared that mother's body, that must at some level be defining of us. And maybe the whole point here is the reason it seems difficult for some of us to re-access that is precisely because what I'm calling some kind of barrier, some kind of virtue, some split, some kind of intervention, some kind of mediator has come in between us and that relationship. Significantly for Freud at least, and I think for Lacan as well, that barrier, that separation may be somewhat different in men to women. Again, a topic for another whole lecture. But let's just keep that in mind. And also bear in mind that maybe despite that one feels that it's not directly, effectively, experientially lived and experienced in all its hugeness, it doesn't fundamentally go away. Maybe it's repressed, but I think you could say that it remains in some instances. Having made that point then, you could argue, all right, you've said that there needs to be this separation. Why? Why should there be this separation? And furthermore, Dr. Hook, you're doing this whole Lacan thing. Why is it that there's moments in Lacan where the presence of the maternal body, the over-proximity of mother beyond a certain age, starts to be thought of as somehow anxiety-provoking, as too much, as somehow excessive? Well, you could do the kind of textbook psychoanalytic answer, the one I've already tried to mobilize and say, well, anthropologically, societally, symbolically, as well as in the domain of the family, you got the whole like incest problem, right? And again, not necessarily in the most literal sense, but in the sense that like, unless one is going to make a partnership for someone from outside your nuclear family, things aren't going to work so well. But here's the example that helps me get a sense of why that separation needs to happen. You could argue, it's just one example, we could find others, but let's just use it for a moment. Black Swan, the Darren Aronofsky movie. In Black Swan, we have an almost nightmarish sense of where maternal separation hasn't happened. The Natalie Portman character has a very intense relationship with her mom. They have, you could say, a kind of imaginary overlap. It's very much a dyad. I mean, in fact, it's almost as if the Natalie Portman character hasn't properly pulled herself outside of the remit of the subjectivity of the mother. The mother was a ballerina, so is she a ballerina. They have some conflicts when at some point the Natalie Portman character even says, I think it's Nina, says, well, you never got this far. So this kind of imaginary rivalry, remember all the mirror stage stuff, still seems to apply. But there's several scenes in the movie where the desire of the mother, for example, Natalie Portman, Nina, comes home, I think it's her birthday, the mother's got a whole cake, She's ballerina, can't eat a whole cake, got to watch her weight or whatever. And says, oh, Mom, I could never eat that. And then in a second, the mother's very upset and is threatening to throw the cake in the dustbin. And so we go from these shared scenes, almost where the two women are giggling together, almost like sisters, to the moment when the wrath of the mother suddenly flares up and Nina is frightened and anxious. Now again, okay, we could be critical of these kinds of examples, but we're just using it in an illustrative capacity. What would happen if there wasn't some kind of separation from the mother? And how might that separation need to happen, and in what way might it be mediated? This is what we're going to try and do as we start to look at these diagrams. Just to underline the point that I've just made, you could say, I'm being a little bit dramatic, a little bit, whatever, silly, you could say that there's a problem in nature, in human developmental nature. Because if we are to survive, try to stress this point, if we're to survive, if we're to be viable human subjects, you presumably need to share the subjectivity of a mom who cares for you, who nurtures you, who enables you to be, essentially. Other mammals don't necessarily have, well, they don't, I think we can be quite unconditional in our use of language here, they don't have, we would like to say, that kind of absolute shared subjectivity, or that nature of the maternal bond isn't quite what it is in human subjects for whom one dies if one doesn't have care for the first, 8, 9, 10 years of one's life. So if that is a kind of biological imperative, that gets us to a certain point. But you've also got then a problem, because how do you bring those two subjectivities apart? That's what I mean by this problem in nature. How do you break, maybe that's too dramatic, how do you attenuate or mediate the most intense relationship of love, nurturance, and desire that you will ever have? That's, I think, our question. The response to that would be to say, trying to muster now the elements of the Lacanian account. Here's my first little attempt at diagrammatization. You could say, right here in this little square, that when things are all going great in the earlier stages of life, here's little C, little child, here's mom. The child is securely located within the remit of the mother. The mother's nurturance, the mother's care, the mother's love. And let's say that happens a lot. But as the child starts to get older, and as it were, life and reality intrude, there will be moments when mom's not around. I've called it absences or breaks in maternal attention. They don't have to be hugely long. Maybe they are. Of course, the variety of empirical details here may vary dramatically from any one life to another. But there will surely be moments when the child over here is not securely, accommodated within the remit of maternal care. Mom won't be around for a while. And hence I've got this dotted outline of mom, where the child has now got to deal with this challenge. The mother's not here. Now, that may be dealt with in multiple different ways. You could maybe start to argue that if you want to do that kind of thing, that a series of developmental issues might emerge from this particular challenge. But we could also say that in the moments when mom is not there, this is the beginnings of the enigma of the desire of the mother. Where is mom? What is she doing? Why is she not here? What is she up to? These absences or breaks in maternal attention, hence mom's in dotted outline, lead to a question. Where is mom? What's mom up to? It's a very undefined question. We don't even know the answer to it. It's a question mark. And it's not even formulated, let's say, in a kind of intellectual or cognitively apparent way. But you could say that there's something like a hypothesis as to where mom is, what mom is doing. And there's two things that are important here. Number one, you could say this is the earliest and most important compass of being, compass of meaning, compass of existence. Where is mom? Where's my caregiver? What's she up to? What does she like? What motivates her? What interests her that's outside of me? Which is both a kind of sad, emotional thing, but also an important step in trying to get a sense of where she's at. So we have there this kind of a compass, the desire of the mother, which is presumably the most important way of getting a sense of how I will exist, how I will be fed, how I will be. But one also starts to get a sense that maybe, just maybe, mom's not complete in and of herself. If mom is sometimes not here, There's maybe something that she desires beyond me, and there's maybe something that I'm not able to fulfill, and maybe she is not this, as it were, overwhelming, controlling presence. Maybe she herself is lacking. I'm going to end this segment of the lectures with one brief question. In Darren Leader's What is Madness, he makes this suggestion. He says, isn't it interesting that in psychosis, we fairly regularly find actually, these moments where one feels, or the psychotic subject experiences these crises of someone's controlling me, there's someone from outside, I'm a pawn in a game, the big other or society is someone pulling the strings, I'm defenseless against the control or the will of others. He makes it in a kind of cautious way, but his suggestion is, doesn't that sound a little bit like what it might be to be a child when one is unsure of the control that one's mom might have? Importantly, we're not trying to pathologize maternal care. And in Danny Nobis's account of this material, he's very clear. He says Lacan goes out of his way not to try and pinpoint one or two empirical instantiations, oh, my mom seems to be very powerful or something, as necessarily the crucial underlying elements of a subsequent pathology or a subsequent psychosis. So Lacan doesn't want to do that, but nevertheless, I think Leader makes an interesting question. If there are moments where, and if there is an extended set of circumstances where a child somehow experiences themselves as fundamentally helpless relative to the mother who knows their thoughts, who knows what they want, who seems to be omnipotent at some level, mightn't that have an interesting resonance with the later advent of some kind of psychotic structure? Let's end there.